June 4, 1942. The Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly under a steel-gray sky, its surface broken only by the wake of warships cutting through the swells. Somewhere northwest of Midway Atoll, Admiral Chuichi Nagumo stood on the bridge of the aircraft carrier Akagi, watching his pilots prepare for what he believed would be another routine victory. The morning air was thick with salt and certainty. His fleet had dominated every ocean they had touched for 6 months. Pearl Harbor, Wake Island, the Dutch East Indies, the Philippines. Each conquest had fallen with clockwork precision. Each enemy had crumbled before the might of the Imperial Japanese Navy. But today, something felt different. Not in the water, not in the weather, but in the silence that hung between radio transmissions. Because 220 miles away, hidden beyond the horizon, American Admiral Chester Nimitz sat in his underground bunker on Oahu, reading decoded Japanese messages that told him exactly where Nagumo was heading and exactly when he would arrive. The Japanese had no idea they were sailing into the most carefully prepared ambush in naval history, and the reason they didn't know would reshape the Pacific War in a single morning. Who was Admiral Nagumo? Before the smoke, before the dive bombers, before the war turned the Pacific into a graveyard of steel and ambition, there was Chuichi Nagumo. He was born in 1887 in Yonezawa, a mountain town where winter winds carved character into men and patience into plans. His father was a samurai retainer, a man of old traditions and quiet honor. Nagumo learned early that victory belonged to those who prepared longest and struck hardest. He entered the Imperial Naval Academy at 17, not because he dreamed of commanding fleets, but because the sea represented order, discipline, precision. By the time he graduated, Japan was already flexing its naval muscles against Russia. Nagumo served as a junior officer during the Russo-Japanese War, watching Admiral Togo destroy the Russian Baltic Fleet at Tsushima. The lesson burned into his mind like a brand. Decisive battle, overwhelming force, perfect timing. These were the pillars of naval victory. For the next 30 years, Nagumo climbed through the ranks like a man ascending a mountain. He was methodical, cautious, thorough. He studied every engagement, memorized every formation, absorbed every lesson the Imperial Navy had to teach. But Nagumo was a product of his time, trained in the art of battleship warfare, where steel giants traded massive shells across miles of ocean. When Japan began developing aircraft carriers in the 1930s, he adapted, but reluctantly. To him, carriers were tools, not weapons. Useful for scouting, valuable for support, but the real fighting would always be done by battleships and cruisers, by men who could see their enemies and feel the deck shudder beneath their guns. This wasn't ignorance. This was experience. Every major naval battle in history had been won by the fleet with bigger guns and thicker armor. The British at Trafalgar, the Japanese at Tsushima, even the Germans in their early victories. Carriers were untested, experimental, fragile. They required perfect weather, perfect coordination, and perfect luck. One mistake, one miscalculation, and a carrier became a floating coffin. But Pearl Harbor changed everything. On December 7, 1941, Nagumo's carrier-based pilots had achieved what no one thought possible. They had crippled the American Pacific Fleet without losing a single major ship. The attack was flawless, surgical, devastating. In 2 hours, Japan had gained 6 months of strategic breathing room, and Nagumo had become the most feared admiral in the Pacific. He didn't celebrate, he studied. He analyzed every detail, every success, every near miss. What he learned would later haunt him. The Americans had been caught completely off guard at Pearl Harbor, but they had also been anchored stationary, defenseless. Their ships were lined up like targets at a carnival. Their planes were parked wing to wing on airfields. Their radar was ignored. Their warnings were dismissed. It had been a perfect storm of American complacency and Japanese preparation. But Nagumo was too smart to believe it would happen again. The Americans would learn. They would adapt. They would be ready next time. What he didn't realize was how quickly they were already adapting and how completely they had penetrated Japanese communications. After Pearl Harbor, Nagumo's fleet swept across the Pacific like a tsunami. They struck the Philippines, sinking American and British warships with contemptuous ease. They hit the Dutch East Indies, crushing Allied resistance in weeks. They raided Ceylon, sending the British Eastern Fleet fleeing across the Indian Ocean. Each victory followed the same pattern. Japanese intelligence identified the target. Nagumo's carriers approached under cover of weather or darkness. His pilots launched at dawn, struck with overwhelming force, and withdrew before the enemy could respond. It was textbook carrier warfare executed with mechanical precision. The Americans called it the Nagumo doctrine: strike fast, strike hard, disappear. But doctrine, no matter how successful, can become a trap. Because the more you win the same way, the more predictable you become. And by June 1942, the Americans were learning to read Nagumo's patterns like sheet music. The intelligence war nobody saw, while Nagumo's pilots dominated the skies above the Pacific. A different kind of battle was being fought in basement rooms thousands of miles away. It was a war of codes and calculations, of intercepted messages and midnight revelations, and the Japanese were losing without even knowing they were fighting. The story began with a man named Joseph Rochefort, a Navy cryptanalyst stationed at Pearl Harbor. Rochefort was brilliant, obsessive, and slightly mad. He worked 18-hour days in an underground bunker, chain-smoking cigarettes and drinking cold coffee while his team tried to crack Japanese naval codes. They called themselves Station HYPO, and their job was to listen to enemy radio transmissions and figure out what they meant. It was like trying to solve a jigsaw puzzle where half the pieces were missing. Pieces were missing, and the other half were written in a language that changed every few weeks. But Rochefort had advantages the Japanese didn't know about. First, the Americans had recovered code books from Japanese submarines and diplomatic pouches captured early in the war. Second, they had begun to recognize patterns in Japanese radio traffic, even when they couldn't read the actual messages. Third, and most importantly, they had learned that Japanese naval officers were creatures of habit. They used the same call signs, followed the same procedures, and made the same mistakes over and over again. By April 1942, Station HYPO was reading roughly 10% of Japanese naval communications. That doesn't sound like much, but 10% was enough to piece together the broad outlines of Japanese strategy. They knew when major operations were being planned. They knew which fleets were involved, and they knew that something big was coming in early June. The breakthrough came on May 20th. Rochefort's team intercepted a message that mentioned an operation against a target coded as AF. The Japanese were planning a massive assault involving 4 aircraft carriers and dozens of support ships. But where was AF? Some intelligence officers thought it might be Hawaii again. Others guessed the West Coast. Rochefort had a different theory. He believed AF was Midway Atoll, a tiny speck of coral and sand 1,300 miles northwest of Hawaii. It wasn't much to look at, just 2 small islands connected by a narrow spit of land. But it was perfectly positioned to serve as an American forward base, a launching point for attacks on Japanese shipping lanes, if Japan wanted to finish what they had started at Pearl Harbor. Midway was the logical next step. To test his theory, Rochefort devised a brilliant deception. He convinced the garrison at Midway to send a fake radio message, transmitted in the clear, reporting that their water purification system had broken down. 2 days later, Station HYPO intercepted a Japanese message reporting that AF was short of fresh water. The trap had worked. AF was definitely Midway. Now they knew where the Japanese were going. The question was when and in what strength. The pieces of the puzzle fell into place like dominoes. Over the next 10 days, Station HYPO intercepted dozens of messages that revealed the scope of Japanese planning. 4 aircraft carriers, 2 battleships, 11 destroyers, transports carrying 5,000 troops. It wasn't just an attack, it was an invasion. Admiral Yamamoto himself was commanding the operation, bringing the entire combined fleet to crush American resistance in the Central Pacific. But the Japanese had made a fatal assumption. They believed their codes were unbreakable. They transmitted detailed operational plans, unit assignments, even weather reports, never suspecting that American cryptanalysts were reading their mail like a morning newspaper. Rochefort's intelligence painted a picture that should have terrified any reasonable commander. The Japanese were bringing overwhelming force against a tiny atoll defended by fewer than 3,000 Marines and a handful of obsolete aircraft. On paper, it looked like another Pearl Harbor waiting to happen. But Admiral Nimitz saw something different in those decoded messages. He saw an opportunity. Because for the first time since the war began, the Americans knew exactly where the Japanese fleet would be and exactly when it would arrive. The hunters had become the hunted, the Japanese confidence machine. Meanwhile, in the wardrooms of the Japanese fleet, confidence ran as thick as engine oil. Admiral Nagumo's staff pored over charts and photographs of Midway, planning their assault with the precision of clockmakers. They had every reason to feel certain. In 6 months of warfare, they had not lost a single major ship. Their pilots were the most experienced in the world. Their tactics were proven, their equipment was superior. The Americans, by contrast, were still reeling from Pearl Harbor, still learning to fight a modern naval war. Japanese intelligence painted a picture of American weakness that bordered on contempt. Their reports suggested that the U.S. Pacific Fleet had been so badly damaged at Pearl Harbor that it would take years to rebuild. Most American pilots were inexperienced rookies, fresh from flight school and terrified of combat. American aircraft were obsolete, their tactics predictable, their morale shattered. The few American carriers still operational were scattered across the Pacific, too far away to interfere with the Midway operation. It was a comforting fiction. and the Japanese believed every word of it. But intelligence, like a mirror, often shows you what you want to see rather than what's actually there. The Japanese had grown so accustomed to victory that they had stopped questioning their own assumptions. They interpreted every piece of information through the lens of their recent successes. When American radio traffic increased around Hawaii, they assumed it was panic. When U.S. reconnaissance flights were spotted near Japanese bases, they dismissed them as desperate scouting missions. When their own submarines reported unusual American ship movements, they filed the reports and forgot about them. Captain Minoru Genda, Nagumo's chief aviation officer, was one of the few voices urging caution. Genda had planned the Pearl Harbor attack and understood better than anyone how quickly naval warfare could shift. He warned that the Americans were adapting faster than expected, that their industrial capacity was beginning to show results, that underestimating an enemy was the first step toward defeat. But his concerns were brushed aside by officers intoxicated with their own success. After all, what could the Americans possibly do against the force that had conquered half the Pacific? The answer was sailing toward them at 20 knots, hidden beyond the horizon like thunder before lightning. Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher's Task Force 17, built around the carriers Enterprise and Hornet, was approaching from the northeast. Admiral Raymond Spruance's Task Force 16, centered on the hastily repaired Yorktown, was closing from the southeast. Together they carried 233 aircraft and the hopes of a nation that had been surprised once, but would not be surprised again. The fatal flaw in Japanese planning wasn't tactical. It was psychological. They had become prisoners of their own propaganda, victims of their own success. Every victory had reinforced their belief in Japanese superiority and American weakness. Every triumph had made them more certain that the next battle would follow the same pattern. But war has a way of punishing those who stop learning, and the Imperial Japanese Navy was about to receive a lesson in humility that would echo across the Pacific. The morning of June 4th dawned clear and calm. Nagumo's pilots warmed their engines as deck crews loaded bombs and checked fuel lines. Intelligence reports confirmed that Midway was lightly defended and unprepared for assault. American naval forces were hundreds of miles away, too distant to interfere. Everything was proceeding according to plan. What the Japanese didn't know was that 3 American carrier groups were already in position, their pilots briefed and ready, their commanders holding decoded copies of the very orders Nagumo was following. The stage was set for the most decisive naval battle of the Pacific War. On one side, the most successful admiral in the Imperial Navy, commanding the fleet that had humbled every enemy it faced. On the other, American commanders who had learned to fight with brains instead of brawn, using the enemy's own confidence against them. In a few hours, the Pacific would belong to whoever made the fewest mistakes. And the Japanese had already made theirs. The first strike launches into silence. At 4:30 a.m., Admiral Nagumo gave the order his crews had been waiting for. Launch the first wave. On the flight deck of the Akagi, engines roared to life in the pre-dawn darkness. Mechanics made final adjustments to bomb loads while pilots climbed into cockpits still warm from engine heat. The smell of aviation fuel mixed with salt air and anticipation. One by one, the aircraft lifted off into the gray morning, their navigation lights disappearing like fireflies against the horizon. Nagumo watched them go with satisfaction of a man who had performed this ritual dozens of times before. 108 aircraft, a perfect blend of dive bombers, torpedo planes, and fighters. Enough firepower to flatten Midway's defenses and clear the way for the invasion force following behind. His pilots were the best in the world, veterans of Pearl Harbor, Wake Island, and the Dutch East Indies. They had never failed him. They would not fail him today. But 240 miles away, radar operators on Midway were already tracking the incoming formation. The Americans had learned hard lessons about the value of early warning. Unlike Pearl Harbor, where radar contacts had been dismissed as friendly aircraft, every blip on the Midway screens was treated as hostile until proven otherwise. By 5:45 a.m., air raid sirens were wailing across the tiny atoll. Marines scrambled to anti-aircraft guns. Pilots ran for their planes. Ground crews pushed bombers toward takeoff positions with desperate urgency. The attack, when it came, was everything Nagumo had promised. Japanese dive bombers screamed down through scattered clouds, their bombs walking across runways and fuel dumps with surgical precision. Torpedo planes skimmed the lagoon, hunting for ships that weren't there. Fighters sank that moved, turning the morning air into a symphony of destruction. In 30 minutes, they had cratered both runways, destroyed the power plant, and set fire to the fuel storage tanks. Black smoke climbed skyward like a funeral pyre. From his flagship, Nagumo received the reports with grim satisfaction. The first phase was complete. Midway's air defenses were crippled. Its runways were unusable. The American garrison was pinned down and bleeding. But his flight leader's final radio transmission contained an ominous note. Recommend second attack to complete suppression of enemy air power. The words hung in the radio room like smoke from a dying cigarette. A second attack meant his planes would need to be rearmed and refueled. It meant delay. It meant staying in these waters longer than planned. Nagumo hesitated. The original plan called for a single devastating strike, followed by immediate withdrawal to avoid American counterattack. But his pilots were professionals. If they recommended a second wave, perhaps it was necessary. He looked at his watch. 7:15 a.m. There was time. The nearest American carriers, according to intelligence, were at least 400 miles away. Even if they launched immediately, their planes wouldn't arrive for hours. He gave the order. Prepare for a second strike on Midway. Below decks, ordnance crews began the complex process of switching bomb loads. The planes returning from Midway carried armor-piercing bombs designed for attacking ships. For a second strike against land targets, they would need high-explosive bombs and incendiary rounds. It was delicate work, requiring precision and time. Bombs had to be winched up from magazines, wheeled across crowded hangar decks, and mounted on aircraft that were still hot from combat. Aviation fuel sloshed in temporary tanks. Oxygen bottles hissed as mechanics topped off breathing systems. What Nagumo didn't know was that his hesitation had already cost him the war. At 6:20 a.m., while his crews were still debating the need for a second strike, American scout planes had spotted his fleet. The message flashed across the Pacific in coded bursts. Enemy carriers bearing 320 degrees, distance 180 miles, course 135, speed 25 knots. Contact report followed by position, composition, and heading. Everything Admiral Fletcher needed to spring his trap. The American response was swift and merciless. By 7 a.m., dive bombers and torpedo planes were launching from 3 different carrier decks. Unlike the Japanese, who had spent precious minutes debating strategy, the Americans attacked with everything they had. No hesitation, no second-guessing, no time for perfect coordination. They had been given a gift, the exact location of the enemy fleet, and they intended to use it. The irony was perfect and terrible. While Nagumo's crews worked frantically to prepare for a second attack on a tiny atoll, American pilots were already climbing toward the altitude they would need to destroy his carriers, while Japanese intelligence officers congratulated themselves on achieving complete surprise. American codebreakers were reading the radio traffic between Nagumo's ships like headlines in a morning newspaper, while Japanese lookouts scanned empty horizons for threats that intelligence assured them were hundreds of miles away. Those threats were approaching at 200 miles per hour, guided by the most accurate intelligence coup in naval history. At 8:30 a.m., a Japanese lookout aboard the cruiser Tone finally spotted what intelligence had promised would never appear. Aircraft approaching from the northeast. Not the scattered, desperate attack of a beaten enemy, but a coordinated strike by planes that shouldn't have been there. The message flashed across the fleet. Enemy aircraft approaching. Large formation, bearing 020. Nagumo felt the deck shift beneath his feet as the Akagi turned into the wind. Around him, the bridge erupted in controlled chaos. Officers shouted orders. Signalmen worked their lamps. The ship's intercom crackled with commands that should have been given an hour earlier. All aircraft prepare for immediate launch. Fighter pilots to stations. Clear the flight deck for combat operations. But it was too late for preparation. The Americans had caught them exactly where Rochefort's intercepts had said they would be, exactly when the decoded messages had predicted, with their decks full of fuel and their planes loaded with the wrong bombs. The attack unfolds in chaos. The first American planes to reach the Japanese fleet were torpedo bombers from the carrier Hornet, flying low and slow, their crews already knowing they were probably flying to their deaths. Torpedo attacks required straight-level approaches that made the attackers sitting ducks for enemy fighters and anti-aircraft fire, but they also required courage. And Lieutenant Commander John Waldron's squadron had that in abundance. From the bridge of the Akagi, Nagumo watched the American planes approach through a forest of anti-aircraft bursts. His Zero fighters dove on them like hawks, their machine guns stitching lines of tracer fire across the morning sky. One American plane exploded in midair. Another cartwheeled into the ocean, its torpedo tumbling away uselessly. A third struggled on with one engine smoking, its pilot fighting to maintain control long enough to launch his weapon. The attack was brave and futile and exactly what Japanese doctrine had prepared for. Torpedo bombers were vulnerable, especially when attacking without fighter escort or dive bomber support. Nagumo's crews had dealt with similar attacks before. They knew how to maneuver, how to coordinate defensive fire. how to minimize damage while maximizing the destruction of enemy aircraft. Within 20 minutes, Waldron's entire squadron had been wiped out. Only one plane survived long enough to launch its torpedo, and that weapon ran straight and true toward the Akagi's hull, before detonating harmlessly against the carrier's armored belt. Japanese gunners cheered as the last American plane splashed into the Pacific. Their anti-aircraft fire had been devastating, their fighter coordination perfect. But their celebration was premature because the torpedo attack had been a diversion, not the main event. While every Japanese eye had been focused on the low-flying torpedo planes, American dive bombers had been climbing to 17,000 feet, hidden in the morning sun, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Lieutenant Commander Wade McClusky led the dive bombers from the Enterprise. 37 dauntless aircraft carrying 1,000-pound bombs and 6 months of American rage. McClusky had been searching for the Japanese fleet for over an hour, his fuel running dangerously low when he spotted the wake of a Japanese destroyer racing to rejoin the main formation. He followed that wake like a highway, and it led him straight to the heart of Nagumo's fleet. What he saw below defied every assumption Japanese intelligence had made about American capabilities. 3 aircraft carriers steaming in formation, their flight decks crowded with planes being prepared for launch. Fuel lines snaked across wooden decks. Bombs and torpedoes lay stacked near aircraft that couldn't get airborne fast enough. It was Pearl Harbor in reverse, a perfectly prepared enemy caught with their defenses down and their escape routes blocked. McClusky didn't hesitate. He rolled his Dauntless into a 70-degree dive, his altimeter unwinding like a broken clock. Behind him, 36 other pilots followed, their bomb sights centered on targets that grew larger with each passing second. The Japanese fleet spread out below them like a detailed model, every ship clearly visible, every weakness exposed. The bombs fell like judgment. McClusky's 1,000-pounder struck the Akagi just aft of the bridge, punching through the flight deck and exploding in the hangar below. The blast ignited aviation fuel and armed torpedoes, turning the carrier's interior into a furnace. A second bomb hit near the forward elevator, buckling the flight deck and trapping aircraft below. Within minutes, Nagumo's flagship was burning from stem to stern, her crew fighting fires they couldn't control with equipment that no longer worked. The carrier Kaga died even faster. 3 bombs hit her flight deck in rapid succession, each explosion feeding the next. Fueled aircraft erupted like Roman candles. Ammunition cooked off in staccato bursts. The wooden flight deck, soaked with gasoline and littered with ordnance, became a river of fire that nothing could extinguish. Men jumped overboard rather than burn alive. Others fought the flames until the heat drove them back, then jumped anyway. The Sōryū took 2 direct hits that penetrated to her engine room. Steam pipes burst. Electrical systems failed. Emergency lighting flickered and died, leaving damage control parties working by the light of fires they couldn't put out. Within an hour, all 3 carriers were burning hulks, their proud flight decks twisted into abstract sculptures of steel and smoke. From the bridge of a nearby cruiser, Admiral Nagumo watched his fleet die and finally understood what American intelligence had been trying to tell him for months. The enemy he had dismissed as weak and demoralized had outthought, outmaneuvered, and outfought the most successful naval force in the Pacific. They had used his own confidence against him, turning Japanese doctrine into a weapon that destroyed everything it was supposed to protect. The radio crackled with damage reports that read like obituaries. Akagi burning and unable to conduct flight operations. Kaga listing to port, fires out of control. Sōryū abandoned and sinking. In 6 minutes, the Americans had accomplished what Japanese planners had thought impossible. They had eliminated Japan's striking power in the Central Pacific and shifted the balance of the entire war. But the battle wasn't over. One Japanese carrier remained, the Hiryu, hidden in a rain squall 20 miles from the burning hulks of her sister ships. Her captain, Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, was already launching a counterattack that would test American resolve one final time. The morning had belonged to the Americans, but the afternoon would tell a different story. The counterattack that changed everything. Admiral Taman Yamaguchi stood on the bridge of the Hiryu, watching smoke columns rise from his burning fleetmates like black pillars holding up a gray sky. Around him, officers waited for orders that would either salvage victory from catastrophe or add one more funeral pyre to the morning's carnage. Yamaguchi was different from Nagumo, younger, more aggressive, trained in the new warfare of aircraft carriers rather than the old certainties of battleship guns. He had argued for months that Japanese doctrine was too rigid, too predictable, too dependent on perfect conditions that war never provided. Now, with 3 carriers burning and American dive bombers circling like vultures, Yamaguchi had his chance to prove that audacity could triumph where caution had failed. He ordered an immediate counterattack, not the carefully planned, perfectly coordinated strike that Japanese doctrine demanded, but a desperate gamble launched with whatever planes he could get airborne. His pilots were exhausted, their aircraft battle-damaged, their fuel running low. But they were also the last hope of salvaging something from the disaster that had consumed the pride of the Imperial Navy. The first wave launched at 10:40 a.m. 18 dive bombers and 6 fighters led by Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi, a pilot who had learned his trade over the burning ruins of Pearl Harbor. They flew northeast toward the American fleet, guided by radio intercepts and the smoke trails of returning enemy aircraft. What they found was Task Force 17 centered on the carrier Yorktown, her flight deck busy with landing operations as American pilots returned from their successful strike on the Japanese fleet. The attack was everything Japanese training had promised it could be. Kobayashi's dive bombers screamed down through American fighter cover, their bombs aimed with the precision that comes from months of combat experience. 3 direct hits shattered the Yorktown's flight deck, ruptured her boilers, and left her dead in the water, listing to port and burning. For a moment it seemed as though Japanese doctrine might prevail after all. That superior pilot training and aggressive tactics could overcome the intelligence advantage that had given the Americans their morning victory. But the Americans had learned more than just how to break codes. They had learned how to absorb punishment and keep fighting. Damage control parties aboard the Yorktown attacked the fires with the efficiency that impressed even Japanese observers. Within an hour, the carrier was underway again, her flight deck patched with steel plates and determination. American pilots who had landed aboard other carriers were already being reassigned to continue the battle from platform whatever could get them airborne. Yamaguchi launched a second strike at 1 p.m., this time with torpedo planes that skimmed the waves like deadly insects, their pilots flying courses that should have been suicide runs but somehow found gaps in American defenses. 2 torpedoes struck the Yorktown's hull below the waterline, flooding her engine rooms and leaving her wallowing helplessly in the Pacific swells. This time, there would be no miraculous recovery. The carrier that had been hastily repaired after the Battle of the Coral Sea was finally dying, her crew abandoning ship as she settled deeper into the water. From his flagship, Admiral Fletcher watched his carrier die and made the decision that would define American naval doctrine for the rest of the war. Instead of withdrawing to LD of declaring it his wounds, instia victory and sailing forward his home, he transferred flag to a cruiser and ordered the attack to continue. The Japanese still had 1 operational carrier. The battle wasn't over until that carrier joined her sisters on the bottom of the Pacific. The final American strike launched at 3 p.m. from the decks of the Enterprise and Hornet, 24 dive bombers that had been held in reserve for exactly this moment. They found the Hiryu steaming alone in a patch of empty ocean, her escort scattered by earlier attacks, her fighter cover depleted by the morning's battles. Lieutenant Earl Gallagher led the attack, his bomb sight centered on the last symbol of Japanese naval aviation in the Central Pacific. 4 bombs hit the Hiryu's flight deck in rapid succession. The explosions ripped through her hangar, ignited her fuel supplies, and set off a chain reaction that no control party could stop damage. Within minutes, she was burning as fiercely as her sister ships, her crew fighting fires that consumed everything they touched. Admiral Yamaguchi, the man who had argued for tactical flexibility and aggressive action, went down with his ship rather than survive the destruction of everything he had worked to build. The Battle of Midway ended not with a whimper but with the sound of steel breaking and dreams burning. By sunset on June 4, 1942, 4 of Japan's finest aircraft carriers lay on the bottom of the Pacific, taking with them over 3,000 men and the illusion of Japanese invincibility. Admiral Nagumo, the man who had commanded the attack on Pearl Harbor, found himself adrift in a destroyer, watching the funeral pyres of his fleet disappear beneath the waves. The Japanese admirals had misread America not because they lacked intelligence, but because they had become prisoners of their own success. They had confused American industrial capacity with American will. They had mistaken early defeats for permanent weakness. Most fatally, they had assumed their codes were unbreakable and their plans unknowable. In doing so, they had handed the Americans the one advantage that mattered most: time to prepare, position to strike, and knowledge to win. Joseph Rochefort and his codebreakers had given Admiral Nimitz the enemy's playbook, but it was American pilots, flying obsolete aircraft with insufficient training, who had turned intelligence into victory. They had absorbed terrible losses, watched their squadrons disappear into anti-aircraft fire, and kept attacking until the job was done. That combination of brains and courage would carry them across the Pacific for the next 3 years. Midway proved that in modern warfare, the side that thinks fastest often beats the side that shoots fastest. The Japanese admirals had learned this lesson too late, written in smoke across a Pacific sky that would never again belong to them alone,